because all that big bear had done is wound them. And he did away with them and finished the rest of them. So there Frank Clark was, up there all alone, just him, his horse, and his dog. And guess what the dog's name was?
Smokey.
The dog's name was Jenny.
Jenny!
Yeah, his favorite dog, his name was Jenny. But okay, Frank Clark now had gone up Logan Canyon. He had gone as far as the wagon could go. No, Harold, just a little. He had gone as far as the wagon could go. Then he abandoned the wagon and he got just his tent and his horse and the dog and took the sheep up to another area where they could find better places for their sheep to eat. Well, on this particular night, it was in the month of August, and up in the mountains in August, September, it's getting cool in the evening. And Frank Clark was in his camp, and it was about midnight, and he heard a noise coming from up the canyon. And he thought to himself, I wonder if it could be that darn bear. Well, nothing happened that night. And the next day, he decided that bear just could possibly be up that canyon. I think I'm going to try and set a trap for that bear. And so Frank Clark, he got himself a trap. In fact, he'd carried it with him up into the canyon, but he got this big bear trap. Now this trap here would weigh, maybe 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds, something like that. The trap that Frank Clark had weighed 23 pounds.
Whoa.
And where these things come together here, this trap that he had some big teeth in it. But look at this small trap here, one that Lance has. And the trap that Frank Clark had was 23 pounds. Well, Frank Clark, he watched around there for a week or so, and he found what is known as some mud wallows. Now, bears are like pigs. You know, pigs can't sweat. Pigs like to wallow in the mud. And bears like to do the same thing. Now, Lance and Bracken, when they go hunting elk, they go over into Wyoming, and that's where they set up their tree stands over these mud wallows. Of course, they're just springs that come out of the ground and form little pools and ponds. And that's where the elk come in, and that's where they try to shoot them with their bows. But Frank Clark, he said to himself, now maybe if I take my trap and set this trap in one of those mud wallows, when that old bear comes in, they get in the mud to cool off. The water will maybe get about that deep. They'd get in the water and they would just wallow around in it and get wet and muddy. And so Frank Clark, he took that 23-pound trap and he put a chain on the trap, just like this chain here, and he tied that chain onto a log, and the log was about 10 feet long and about maybe a foot in diameter. So it was a very big log, but they don't tie them down. How come, Lance? How come they don't tie the log down?
Because then they can pull loose or chew their leg off easier, but if they have something they can move with, they can just keep moving and moving, and you can follow them, but they can't quite get loose.
Okay, so this was a log that this old bear could drag. Well, Frank Clark, he went up to the mud wallow and he put the trap in the mud wallow and went back to his tent and was trying to go to sleep. The next morning he got up and went up into the mud wallow to check it, and what had happened, the old bear had come into the mud wallow and he had found the trap. He hadn't stepped in it, but he had taken the trap, pulled it out of the water, pulled it out of the mud, pulled the chain and everything out and set it on the bank, and got in and got himself covered with mud and went on about living. So when Frank Clark got up there that morning, there was his trap all set off, but no bear in it. And you know, for the better part of the year, Frank Clark fought this old bear like this. The bear was just outsmarting him all the time. Every time he would put the trap in the mud wallow, the bear would pull the trap out, set it on the bank, but he couldn't touch the trap or catch the bear. And so Frank Clark was so frustrated, very frustrated. He didn't know what to do. So one time he went up to this mud wallow and he found quite a lot of water in it, and he found that the bear had made a little bit of a break in the dam, and the water had come out of the mud wallow and down into a smaller area. And so Frank Clark said to himself, I'll bet if I go up there and set my trap in this smaller part, the smaller pond, I wonder if I could catch him then. So this is what he did. He took the trap out of the big pond and he put it in the small pond, went back down to his tent and settled down for the night. Well, along about midnight, again on a moonlit night like this, he awoke in the middle of the night and he heard the worst sound he had ever heard in his life. Screaming. And hear his horses were upset. And the dogs were concerned and they were starting to bark. And he didn't know what it was. The sound was like a big high-pitched scream. Maybe like a mountain lion or something like that. So the middle of the night, it's getting cold, and Frank Clark got up and took his rifle, 25-35 rifle, and he made sure it was loaded. Good hunters always make sure the rifle is fully loaded. And this gun, when it was loaded, it had 7 bullets in it. 7 bullets, and it was fully loaded, and he felt quite secure. He wasn't frightened of bears because he had seen a lot of them. In fact, in his lifetime, Frank Clark had killed several bears. In fact, the story says that he had killed 20 or 30 bears, but he had never seen anything as big as what he was going to see with this Old Ephraim. Well, So here Frank Clark was with all that terrible noise coming from up the canyon. He got up, he took his rifle, his dog, Jenny, stayed in the camp, but Frank Clark took his rifle, and when he got out of bed, now you must remember that back in those days, guys didn't wear pajamas. Now you guys have seen your mom and dad wander around the house sometimes in their long underwear. Well, Frank Clark wasn't wearing that kind of underwear, but old Frank Clark just had a long underwear. In fact, they'd wear these things day in and day out, almost months on end, to the point that if you dropped those underwear, they'd almost bust because they'd been worn so long. So there was Frank Clark in the middle of the night, hearing this terrible noise coming from up the canyon. And here he is standing out there in his long underwear. He went clear to his ankles. And I'm sure his hind end wasn't covered up either.
What's not?
So he took his rifle and he headed up the canyon. And as he got up the canyon, he could hear his horses starting to run away. At least one of the horses. And he was very concerned about that horse running away because that was their automobile, that horse. That was their only means of transportation, with that horse. Well, he had to forget about the horse, and he continued on up the canyon. And the further up the canyon he got, the louder all that noise became. And as he got further up the canyon, he said to himself, I'll bet I know what happened. I'll bet old Ephraim stepped into that big 20-pound trap. I'm going to go up and see if I can get him. And now remember, it's pitch black. There's a moon was shining, but it was still pitch black, and he had to go right on the trail. And he said to himself, I'll bet that bear is on that same trail. And here I am going up that trail. And so Frank Clark, he kept going up there, and as he got closer, this is the first time in all the years that he had hunted killed bear, this is the first time he said that he was frightened. He said he was absolutely scared to death because of that terrible noise that he could hear. And he knew it just had to be old Ephraim.